Welcome to the Assembly. This is a space we've created for very passionate people to come together and have an authentic, unfiltered conversation about taking over the world. No, I mean, transforming the world. Now, this isn't your average news show with talking head commentators and pundits. This is where some of the many beers and doers of the world have gathered to hash out historic and topical issues and to highlight the hard work that is necessary to make the world a more just and free place. All are welcome. That means you too. Provided that you adhere to a few agreements, that we share responsibly, that we listen deeply, we question bravely, and we speak our truth honestly. We invite you to assemble and join the conversation.
Thank you, Rosario. I'm your hostess with the mostest, Erica Williams-Simon, but you can call me E because you're a part of the Assembly now, and that makes you family. All right, and that means we can have some real talk today about a topic you've probably been hearing a lot about lately: protest. From the NFL to Uber to shutting down the airports over the Muslim ban or shutting down highways to say that Black lives do matter. Everywhere you turn these days, someone is marching, boycotting, campaign, calling, tweeting. And make no mistake about it, we think this is a good thing. It means that people are speaking up and owning their power and fighting back. But have you ever wondered whether or not all of this protesting actually works? How much of it is really making a difference? Is there a right or wrong way to do this? And how can we make sure that all of our actions, no matter how we choose to engage, are effective? In other words, what's the deal with protest? Y'all ever ask yourselves that sometimes? What is really the deal with protest? Well, we're gonna talk about that today, Assembly style. We've got a great group of doers and dreamers and experts who may all have different approaches, but are all committed to radically changing the world. So I'm so honored to be sharing the space today with, all the way on the end, Dr. Maytha Alhassen, a Syrian-American journalist, poet, and scholar. Patrisse Khan-Cullors, co-creator of Black Lives Matter, yes, founder of Justice LA and a senior fellow at Moms Rising. Gyasi Ross, author, speaker, storyteller from Blackfeet Nation. Matt McGorry, you know him as an actor and an activist. And our girl, OG Assembly member, Rosario Dawson. Y'all, protest. Let's start someplace simple. Well, I think it's simple. When you hear the word protest, what is the first thing that comes to your mind?
Highways.
Highways. Why highways?
Because I feel like we're the generation that we're like, let's do how many highways can we shut down in 1 year?
Yeah.
And I remember the first highway protest I witnessed. It was Atlanta, and it was after the non-indictment of Darren Wilson, and all of us were doing protests, and they took it to the next level, and they did a highway, and I was like, okay, well, you doing a highway? I think I'm gonna do a highway next. And I think it's also interesting because it's the place where we get the most nastiness from people. Really? Yeah, because people are like, well, my job, and I need to get to work, and people start bringing up paramedics, but nobody talks about, well, what about the Black people that got killed and murdered by the state? And what happens to their lives? What happens to their families' lives? And can we take 30 minutes, an hour out of our day to literally be in protest? And also, it's fun to shut down a highway.
Is it?
Yeah. How many folks have shut down a highway? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Was it fun for you?
Oh, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Did you just go straight to that, or was there any element of fear? Like, this is
There's
an
always
escalation.
fear. There's always fear. There's always fear in protests because there's always risk in protests. But it doesn't actually, for me, you can have fear and courage at the same time.
Yeah.
And so part of shutting down a highway and protesting takes courage, and that fear is going to be there no matter what. But it's about how do you shut it down in a way that's smart and effective. So that looks like bringing lawyers. It looks like having conversations around what the risks are. You know, do you want to take a risk? You can most likely be arrested. I mean, there's all these in-betweens that take you to a highway protest.
I pull back a little bit and I think social movements, because effective protests are attached to social movements. If you just have spur protests like the Uber one, what is that connected to? Is that connected to a divest, invest movement? Or is it just one sort of protest to push a reform or a change? And yeah, that was great, but Lyft has other people who are just as horrendous on their board as the people at Uber. But again, because I don't know if that was necessarily tied to a certain sort of social movement, which we could talk about what a social movement is, then I don't know how effective protests are.
I've only been political for the last 3 years, and I think I'm sitting with a panel of people who've been doing this work for so much longer. So it actually takes me back to a time when I did not know the answer to that question, and probably would have thought like, I don't know, like how does it work, right? And these are conversations that I have a lot now, and I think are important for me to contextualize for other people, and especially for other white folks who I think we tend to not have, we don't necessarily have to be political for our survival, so we don't have to necessarily learn that at an early age. So, and we're not taught the way that it works purposefully, right? Like, because classrooms are not going to teach you, the news is not going to show that. They'll occasionally show, the protests, if you do enough things, if you shut down a highway, but they're not actually connecting like, oh wow, and this reform or this law got passed or this happened, and actually, or in the Me Too movement, and thank you to all, the women who've come out all along and been fighting for this, and thank you, Anita Hill, and it's not, we don't acknowledge the sort of history of how that happens, and it's a very, I think we live in a culture where we expect, you take a pill and this happens, and I think we think that happens the way we think that happens in politics too, and I think even in sort of the American Revolution, Howard Zinn talks about, I think quoting one of the founding fathers, the revolution began, 14 years before the actual, the first bullet was fired. But that's not as fun for people to tell as a story often.
Right. There's a lot of history there that we don't often know and aren't taught. Gyasi, what do you think about when you hear protests?
I usually think of bad marketing.
Exactly.
I think what happened last year at Standing Rock was ingenious, where they would not acknowledge nor accept the title of protesters, but instead said we're water protectors. Because the best protest to me, above all things, I consider myself a storyteller, and the best protests are stories. They're telling a very compelling and necessary countervailing narrative. And they should get credit as such. No, you presented your story. You had your opportunity to show white supremacy or misogyny or sexism or whatever it might be. That story's been told for a very long time, this dependence upon fossil fuels. And then we had somebody, an incredible storyteller here in the audience, LaDonna Brable-Allard, who said, okay, you had your chance to tell this story. Let us tell this other story. And they bring it, and I think that with proper marketing, they could be something other than protesters, but instead be a part of what the story you're trying to tell is.
Do you think the word protest is bad?
I think that it's misleading because it always, as it's commonly used, is always in opposition to something. When the actual etymology of the word is to publicly publicly exclaim something. It doesn't require it to be oppositional. And so you can have a proactive protest. And I think that it's misleading. I don't think it's good or bad, but I think it's misleading.
That reminds me, I know, Rosario, I've asked you this question before about when you hear the word, what do you think? And your first reaction is?
No.
The word no.
And that starts off as kids, it's like that first time where you're like, no. And as you're saying, it's rather than it just being against, it's an assertion. It's an expression of like, this is actually where I draw the line for myself. That word no is actually also saying yes to something else. I'm willing to take or compromise or sacrifice whatever that looks like so I can say yes to this because I'm not gonna just accept the role that I've been given. And just looking at that through history. So for me, it is trying to even transform it beyond that and reclaim a different narrative around it, like the water protectors.
I love the idea of it being an alternative story, right? The story that hasn't been taught. Matt, what was the story of protest that you have been taught?
It's this mythologized thing that is stripped of any sort of radical edges and just shaved down to a complete, like Martin Luther King is a perfect example of that. And the lack of sort of the understanding that he was on the most wanted list. The FBI was writing letters to him to tell him to kill himself. Like, he was not, most white people at that time would have been like, this is like, why is he being disrespectful? Like the Colin Kaepernick thing, right? And so you have to have the future mindset to look back now, think 40 years in the future and look back and say, what should I do now that is not normalized now, that is controversial now, that is going to work towards that future. The fact that white people are consistently will say, most white people will say that black and white people or people of color and white folks will have pretty equal opportunities at like almost all points in history. Right, and that just tells us about our lack of perspective.
Yeah, right. I remember having that kind of aha moment when I first heard the story of Fred Hampton and understanding really the context behind how this Black Panther leader had been targeted and assassinated. And I was shocked at the level, right, of hatred and strategy and intentionality behind that. I'd never been taught that before and taught that in school. So how, in the context of people not knowing that history, do you then engage folks in saying, let's tell a different story when they don't know the story they've been told is wrong?
Right. Thinking about Fred Hampton, what we don't know is he was the originator of the idea of the Rainbow Coalition. So Jesse Jackson picks it up later in the 1980s and he's running for president. But Fred Hampton, as far as we are all concerned, got killed because he was trying to unite people across all races. And that was his call for revolution in that moment. And he was very young when that happened. So there's a sociologist named Charles Tilly who has written about social movements, and he has a basic definition around it. And you can contest it too, and a lot of folks have. And so he basically says that a social movement is a series of contentious displays, performances, and campaigns in which ordinary people make a collective claim on others. This is the context we have to understand what a protest is. So if you just saw folks on a highway leading a protest, you're like, oh, they're angry Black people. And if you see Palestinians, that are leading a protest against Trump declaring Jerusalem the capital of Israel, you think, here they go again, angry Palestinians. And they don't understand that this is part of a 70-year movement, right? And they don't understand that Black Lives Matter is part of a much longer, centuries-long movement, is an iteration of a Black freedom movement. The other interesting point about the revolution, where we can kind of start from, is there's a historian named Gerald Horne who contends that the American Revolution was not necessarily a revolution, it was a counter-revolution to maintain slavery. Right. And so if we start from there, we can get a proper understanding of where our history emerged, but we have to start even further back because we have to go back to the ethnic cleansing and genocide of Indians on this land. And I would also like to acknowledge we are on stolen land right now as well, the Tongva people. We have to start unfolding and unlearning. That's the part of this process. And this is why when I heard Matt's story about how did you get politicized, I was really interested because it is always initiated through some sort of unlearning process. And once you get people to have one aha moment of something that I definitively believed was true and just had a tiny little question mark, that's when you have an opportunity to engage. And so we start from there. We start from saying, well, do you know why they protested? Do you know why Colin Kaepernick took a knee? Do you know why people were opposing Uber? Like what was motivating those?
Do you know why Martin Luther King Jr. was eventually actually killed? What was he actually doing at that time?
Right.
Because we've taken out so much, we've watered down what that whole March on Washington was. But it was a huge act of civil disobedience at the time, with everything going against it actually happening. But when you look at it, it's so sanitized now. It just looks like this really beautiful thing that now we're all in agreement was a nice moment. Right. And we can put it behind us, but we forget like what was actually happening in the criticism he was doing of our international politics. He was doing what Fred was doing as well, of just that rainbow coalition that then gets really dangerous. And because we don't explore that and we don't think about that, then when the news does address protest, and the way that they do it is going, we're going to try to figure out how to find Black Lives Matter for the businesses that lost money because they were protesting outside, and it interfered with their right to capitalism. And so then that's how people end up. That's the story that they're told. Then you're really losing out on an opportunity to really hear their voices because you've been given the perspective with which to look at it.
Does popularity actually hinder or does it help? And I'm thinking right now, obviously, of like NFL protests, right? When you get to the point where the owner of the Dallas Cowboys is on a knee too, and you're like, but I don't think you really, I don't know, right? Or when movements become t-shirts and slogans, right? When it becomes cool to say whatever the catchphrase is, that water is life, or is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Where is the kind of nuance in that, in wanting growth, but also questioning, is that watering it down? How do we, talk to me about that.
I think that if you don't have risk inherently, whether that's risk of suspension from an NFL team by virtue of kneeling, or alternatively of getting arrested, then you've gone too far. then it's been watered down, or it's been disseminated too widely. Because if everybody truly believed that, then we would have a policy change, and those hope for enhancements or betterments to life would be actually enacted. And so at that point, your actions aren't really meeting up with your T-shirt. You understand what I'm saying? So I think that generally, if there is no risk, if everybody is wearing a water is life shirt, then there's a problem. And so that's one of the things that, one of my mentors, he passed a few years ago. His name is Uncle Billy Frank Jr. He got arrested 52 times in pursuance of exercising his treaty rights to fish, to just fish, do the thing that there was a legal agreement to do. He arrested over the course of 29 years. And everything that he did, there was risk. Because protest, I believe, is supposed to be something that's provocative. And if it's not provocative to anybody, then kind of what's the point? Because once again, going back to the etymology, it's about publicly attesting to a particular belief that's supposed to motivate change. And so absolutely, I believe that there's a place of desensitization to protest. There's a risk of popularization of protest, where the mainstream gets a hold of it, and all of a sudden, okay, it's really cool to wear that dashiki. It has no significance anymore.
I mean, I think it's complicated because you want your movement to be a mass movement, and you want people to say Black Lives Matter, and you want it, you want to force presidential candidates to have to say Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. Those are political wins and victories. I think when you have to challenge, when your movement is being co-opted, and when it's becomes everything matters. Dogs matter, homes matter. And I think that becomes a challenge living in a capitalist system.
How is capitalism tied to that?
When something becomes a commodity. And it's easy to become a commodity when it becomes trendy. When we first started Black Lives Matter, I did not imagine that it would be in every TV show, that there would be a Black Lives Matter character everywhere. It has become like a staple to communicate Black Lives Matter. But the question I always ask myself, has the material conditions for Black people changed? I can turn on my TV screen and I feel proud. I feel proud that we were able to do this and we're still doing it, and people are forced to have a conversation. But I still live in a county that has the largest jailer in the world, that locks up the most Black people, that a DA that refuses to prosecute any killer cops. I still live in a county that Black people are being driven out of. And the question becomes for all organizers, right? Like, are we changing the material conditions for our people? And that, to me, it's very easy to get seduced and caught up in the popularity of something you've created. After years of building something, people are listening. People want to talk to you. But it is not about building yourself or the brand of your movement. It is about, how do we stop getting cops to stop killing Black people? How do we do that? It's a decades long movement. We've been doing this for 500 years.
Picking back off of Patrisse, what happens when you try to create and envision movements in a capitalist society? And in a capitalist society like America that tells itself the story that we have free speech, we are the land of the free. So it's really difficult to come up against that. But what I like to do is take a step back and say, what we're actually living under is what an Italian Marxist named Antonio Gramsci called cultural hegemony. So that's how we can co-opt symbols, right? A cultural hegemony won't directly put oppressive forces that are very visible to the rest of the public, like a dictatorship would. So like if you go somewhere like Syria, you weren't allowed to assemble in a group of more than 4 people without getting permission from the government to do so. And that was like a very clear dictatorship that people could band together and at some point start to oppose. But here, it's not very clear to the whole nation those moments of like deep dictatorial oppression, because there's something called cultural hegemony, where the state takes those symbols and co-opts them. And this is actually part of the strategy, is to co-opt Black Lives Matter, is to co-opt Martin Luther King's image,
Che Guevara.
Che Guevara, put him on a t-shirt.
Commercialize it.
Right, and it's
make it about that one leader, and then when they're toppled, then we don't have to talk about the movement itself.
exactly.
And all of the people who are part
And then
of it.
we've absorbed it, so we're a good country that learned. So
Right.
that's the story that we have to learn to really decipher when we try to understand the tactics of the state or the tactics of the systems that are oppressing us.
The critical thinking that continues to be there, where we can look at a cause and think that we're all gung-ho for it and not recognize, as we're talking about women pushing back against sexual harassment and everything that's going on right now, and where it's really kind of hit this fever pitch, we're not noticing also that why does it take 30 women to say something about this person and 1 man to say something about him, and that's listened to? Even as these things are being exposed, it's still mirroring the exact same circumstances and issues as to why it is so difficult for women to step forward, and just showing the real disparity around belief.
Please give a big welcome to poet, vocalist, and activist Gina Loring.
So this song I wrote after the Trayvon Martin tragedy. Obviously, there are many, 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 many more names to add to the list. I feel like oftentimes when these kind of communal tragedies happen, it just kind of becomes a name. It becomes a statistic. And what always moves me so much is thinking about that this was somebody's child. You know, this was somebody's baby. This was once someone was excited about their first steps and their first words. So I wanted to just honor that humanity. So this is for Trayvon Martin. You were somebody's baby. You were somebody's child. Now you live in headlines. Set the world on fire. You were somebody's baby. You were somebody's child. Now you are an angel watching from the sky. Could have been my brother. Could have been my son. Nowhere is more godless than the barrel of a gun. When will the last lesson be learned? When will the final bridge be burned? When will the whole world stand up and say enough is enough? 'Cause you were somebody's baby. You were somebody's child. Now you live in headlines. Set the world on fire. You were somebody's baby. You were somebody's child. Now you are an angel watching from the sky. Who knows the man you would have become? Who knows the things you might have done? never know what you could do. Can't get back what was stolen from you. They say, be afraid of the night. Well, I'm more afraid of men who don't know wrong from right. Men with guns, trained to fear my brethren. Well, as far as I can see, the boogeyman is he. As far as I can see, the boogeyman is he. So when he lays his head down, when he feels the panic and the pain, when he lays his head down of a child attack walking in the rain, when he lays his head down, when he feels the depth of what he did, when he lays his head down, beg forgiveness for such a sin. 'Cause you were somebody's baby. You were somebody's child. Now you are an angel watching from the sky. Thank you.